Hello and welcome to the 12th Cloudscape Dev Log. This video was supposed to get made quite some time ago, but I just got caught up in a whirlwind of various different game dev tasks, but I'm happy to announce that I've already been working on the next devlog after this one, and it should be coming within a week after this one goes up. In the previous video, I mentioned I had more updates to talk about, but just didn't want to cram it all into one video, so this is the second part of those updates. I talked about doing some complex overhauling to the way items were being handled, and afterwards I didn't want to dive into more complex stuff for a while. So moving on to something a bit simpler for my brain, I decided to get stuff spawning on top of cliffs. For the longest time, cliffs have been pretty much a cosmetic thing. The players couldn't walk on top of them, and nothing could spawn on top of them. I've changed how cliffs and divots work in the previous devlogs, so now that they're traversable, I figured it only makes sense to spawn stuff up there. So now after some fiddling, I've got some stones, trees, and grass and other things spawning on top of cliffs. After implementing this, I quickly realized there was still no way for players to actually get up there. I planned to add natural ramps to cliffs at some point, but I also wanted to add the ability for players to add ladders or staircases to cliffs in order to easily reach them. I went ahead and drew some ladder sprites, created the items, made new recipes for them, and added all of that info into the game. The last step was to create a special ladder structure so that when you equip a ladder item and press the tool button, the structure mode activates and you can place down the ladder. I had to add in some custom conditions to make sure the player can only place the ladder at the right spot on cliff walls, with empty space above and below the ladder, but once that was set up, it was fairly easy to get ladders placed down. Now ladders can be placed, but they are kind of pointless if the player can't climb them. The final step was to set up an interact script so when the player presses the action button at the top or bottom of the ladder, they attach themselves to the ladder and can move up and down. This was a simple process of creating a new boolean called isClimbing. If it is set to true, it means we need to switch the player controls over to climbing and also change the player's animation. Now the player can climb up and down at their own pace or just chill on a ladder for a while for some reason. One thing I still need to do with the ladders is improve how the players appear when near the top of a ladder. Right now they get to the top and sort of keep climbing up into the air until they clear the ladder, and then they dismount. I'd like to add a special animation for the player actually lifting themselves up at the top of the ladder to dismount it, but for now the functionality is implemented and animations take a long time to do, so I'm okay with it being in an unfinished state right now. Speaking of unfinished states, I've been meaning to add more growth stages to various things you can forage on the island. Mainly the mushrooms, the berry bushes, and flowers. Up until now, these things would just randomly spawn into the world fully grown, which didn't make a lot of sense. I've gone ahead and added growth stages for most of these, and created sprites for them as well. Now mushrooms grow through several stages and can only be harvested when fully mature. This creates a bit more variety for the environment, and it also makes foraging slightly more interesting because now when you see something growing, you can't just run and grab it. Instead, you'll need to remember to check back on it later, which just helps to add immersion and give the environment a bit more life. After doing that, I wanted to add more stuff to forage from the land overall. First up, I decided to add dandelions. I picked the dandelion for a couple of reasons. For starters, it's a flower you can eat, which I find pretty fascinating. I also wanted to add more edible things to forage from your island, so this feels like a good choice. Another reason was that dandelions actually have two interesting stages of their development. There's the stage where they are a yellow flower, which you can eat, and there's a stage where it's nothing but a bunch of white seeds. This was an opportunity for me to take the harvesting system a step further, and so I've created a condition which allows you to harvest some things at two different stages of growth instead of just the mature stage. So now you can pick a dandelion in its flower and its white seed stage. You will get two different items depending on the stage it was picked. The yellow flower you can eat to restore energy, while the white variation you can blow into the wind. This might seem like a bit of a silly thing to add to the game at this point in time, but honestly it was just fun to make, and part of developing a game is about having fun, and not just focusing entirely on grinding out the most important mechanics in your game first. So yeah, you can now blow dandelions into the air because why not? One additional thing to take away is that you can also gain energy back when you do this, sort of like just revitalizing your spirits. So there's not a big penalty for not harvesting dandelions in their edible stage. If you've been following along with the devlogs or development of the game, you may have noticed I've changed the sprites for trees and added another type of tree to the game. I felt like the old trees were just too narrow and small and didn't really fill out the space very well, so I've redesigned the pine trees and added a maple tree. While working on the tree artwork, I also completely integrated trees into the current growable object system, which is great because trees are no longer in their own isolated scripts, which means whenever I make improvements to growable objects, trees benefit directly. Finally, with growable objects, I took on the task of making sure growable things properly wither in off-seasons and added a weed object that growable things will turn into when they die. The weeds will hang around until you either pick them or whack them with a hammer or sword. This is a sort of crucial necessity for growable objects because otherwise you have crops that just survive all year round. Having your tomatoes last through winter might be nice, but it's not exactly realistic and doesn't really provide any sort of challenge when farming if nothing can die when a season changes. One other thing of note that I've changed is the way sleeping bags now function. Before, a crafted sleeping bag could be used 5 times before it was destroyed. Each time you used the sleeping bag, you could sleep up to 8 hours to restore health and energy. This method worked for the most part, but testers helped point out to me that it was a bit frustrating if they accidentally woke up from their sleeping bag or used it when they didn't mean to, because it meant one less use from the item in total. It was too easy to accidentally use the sleeping bag 5 times without getting the most out of it. So I've since changed it to now have essentially 40 uses, but the uses drop by 1 for each hour slept. The end result is you get the same amount of possible use time for the sleeping bag, but it's much more forgiving in the fact that you can keep using it a bunch of times until you've slept in it for 40 hours total. You might be wondering why I limit the use of the sleeping bag at all. The reason behind it is that sleeping is actually hugely beneficial because it provides you with not only energy and health, but also the ability to fast forward time. As you sleep, time moves 6 times faster than normal. Giving the player an item that allows them to fully restore all health and energy and also fast forward time without limiting the amount of uses would be pretty game breaking. Another addition I've made which relates to sleeping and eating is a new debuff system. How this works is players are now limited to how much they can eat or sleep over a certain period of time. Eat too much and you receive a stuffed debuff. This debuff will prevent you from eating for 8 hours. To make things more interesting, the debuff actually provides a small bonus. The player gets 10 bonus reserve energy. Reserve energy is also a newly added feature. This energy is displayed in a teal color at the left side of the normal energy display. It will only get used when the player runs out of normal energy, so it's sort of there as a backup extra 10 energy. A similar debuff is applied to sleeping. If a player sleeps 8 hours within a certain period of time, they will receive the rested debuff. This debuff makes it so players cannot sleep for 16 hours. Just like with the stuffed debuff, the rested debuff provides a small bonus to help the player out during the debuff period. The player will be granted a full reserve heart, which works exactly like the reserve energy. The whole reason I've implemented these 2 debuffs is because I wanted to create a solution for players just spam eating food or sleeping for way longer than what should be possible in order to skip massive amounts of time. Having no limits to these things can sort of break a game like this really easily. If you can just forever eat food with no limits, then the entire energy system sort of loses meaning. Why even have an energy system if it becomes too easy to restore the lost energy? Same with health. If the player can quickly and easily restore all of their health, then losing health doesn't really have much impact. Inversely, if it's too difficult to restore energy and health, the player ends up struggling far too much and can find themselves just waiting around until they can get energy or health back. This is actually a hard thing to balance for the game, especially with early gameplay where the player doesn't have access to lots of high energy replenishing foods or resources to create beds and sleeping bags to rest. To solve this, I ramped up the amount of overall food that can be found around the island, and I've also added a sleeping bag to the player's backpack that they receive at the start of the game. I think these changes should provide some cushion for players just starting out without making things too easy. Aside from that stuff, I've most recently been working on adding the map and journal into the game. The map gives you a rough overview of the whole area and can include various markers to help you find your bearings and also locate other villagers and important areas. I'm just showing a quick glimpse of it here, but I'll get more in depth about it in a future video once I've developed the feature more. The latest thing I've been working on, which I can't really show yet, is just planning out a couple of the major areas of the game, and I've started working on the level editor, which I'll use to build out these handcrafted areas. So far I've got these custom islands loading in properly, so the next step is really just to start laying everything down. The coming months are going to be pretty exciting for me, as it's going to be a lot of content development. I'll begin working on one of the biggest and most challenging aspects of the game, which is creating really good villager AI. That's about all I have for this video. I'm sure I've left out quite a few things, so if you don't want to miss out some of the smaller developments, consider joining the Cloudscape Discord. I chat pretty frequently in there with all of the members, and I love answering questions or listening to feedback and ideas for the game. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Everyone's support means a lot to me and pushes me to work even harder. As always, thanks for watching.